The nearest neighbor was 11 miles away. Someone still knocked on our door at 2 a.m. All right, welcome back. If you're new here, this is where people send in the stuff that actually happened to them. No scripts, no actors, just real accounts. Today's theme is isolation, the kind of remote that means no cell signal, no neighbors, and no one coming if you scream. Both of today's stories come from places you'd think were safe simply because nobody else was around to cause trouble. Turns out that's not always how it works. Let's get into the first one. Story 1. The Fire Tower. I took a summer job as a fire lookout in a national forest, mostly because I wanted a quiet season away from people after a rough year. And the pay, while modest, came with free housing in a small cabin at the base of the tower, which made the whole arrangement feel less like a job and more like an escape I was getting paid to take. The job itself was simple. Climb the tower a few times a day, scan the tree line for smoke, radio, and anything unusual. Otherwise, the days were mine to fill however I wanted. The nearest town was almost 2 hours away by truck, and the nearest other human being, another lookout stationed at a different tower, was roughly 11 miles through dense forest, close enough to matter on a map, but functionally as far as the moon, especially once the fire roads got overgrown enough that driving between stations wasn't really an option most of the season. The first few weeks were exactly the peaceful reset I'd been hoping for. I read books, hiked the trails around my station, and got used to a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat at night if I focused on it. A kind of quiet that took some real adjustment after years of living in a city where there was always some sound in the background, even at 3 in the morning. I want to be clear, I wasn't someone prone to nervousness. I'd camped alone plenty of times before, never had an issue with solitude, and honestly considered myself pretty hard to spook, which is part of why what happened that one night has stayed with me as long as it has. About a month in, on a night with no wind at all, completely still, I heard 3 knocks on the cabin door a little after 2 a.m. I sat up immediately, certain I'd misheard, since there was genuinely no one for miles who could have made that sound. I waited, and it happened again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, evenly spaced. Looking back, there were smaller things in the days leading up to that night that I brushed off at the time, and only really thought hard about afterward. A couple mornings before, I'd noticed the birds had gone unusually quiet around dawn, which normally was the loudest part of the day out there, full of that layered forest noise you stop consciously hearing after a while, because it's just always present. That morning it wasn't. I remember standing on the little porch with my coffee, noticing the silence, and thinking it was probably nothing. Maybe a hawk had passed through and spooked everything into hiding for a bit. The kind of explanation you reach for, because it lets you keep drinking your coffee in peace. I didn't think about it again until much later. I called out, asking who was there, my voice sounding strange in a cabin that had only ever held my own voice for weeks, the sound of it almost unfamiliar bouncing off the bare wood walls. No answer. I grabbed the radio, the only real connection I had to anyone, and tried raising the other lookout station, my hands not quite steady on the handset. It took several tries before a groggy voice answered, and when I explained what was happening, he went quiet for a moment before telling me, flatly, to just not open the door, no matter what. There was something in that pause before he answered that told me more than his actual words did. It wasn't confusion, the way you'd expect from someone woken up at 2 a.m. by a rambling radio call about knocking. It was recognition, like he already knew exactly what I was describing before I'd even finished describing it, and was just deciding how much of it he actually wanted to get into right then. I asked him why, and he said something I've never forgotten. He said sometimes hikers who get lost out here, badly lost, days lost, end up walking toward any structure they can find, and that by the time they reach one, they're not always in a state you want to open a door for. He said it had happened to him once, years earlier, and left it at that, unwilling to elaborate further even when I pushed, his voice taking on a tone that made it clear this was a topic he decided long ago not to revisit in any detail, no matter who was asking or how frightened. They sounded on the other end of the radio. The knocking continued for almost 20 more minutes, sometimes pausing for a few minutes before starting again. Never any voice accompanying it. No calling for help. Nothing but that same patient, 3-knock rhythm, evenly spaced every time, like whatever was making it had all the patience in the world and no urgency at all, which somehow felt worse than if it had been frantic or desperate. I sat against the far wall of the cabin the entire time, radio clutched in my hand, listening to something on the other side of a door that no lost hiker should have been able to find in the pitch dark. On a night with no moon, from 11 miles through forest terrain that took me most of a day to hike even in daylight. Along trails, I sometimes lost track of myself, despite having walked them dozens of times by that point in the summer. At one point, close to an hour after it started, the knocking stopped entirely for what felt like a long stretch, long enough that I let myself believe it might genuinely be open. Then, from a spot along the wall, a little further from the door than where the knocking had originated, I heard something drag slowly across the exterior siding. A long, low scraping sound that moved the entire length of that side of the cabin before stopping. I didn't move from my spot against the far wall for the rest of the night. A few days later, still shaken, still turning the whole thing over in my head, every time I climbed the tower, I found myself checking the old logbook that previous lookouts had kept in the cabin. Most of it was mundane. Weather notes, fire spottings, a few complaints about mice, but tucked into an entry from 4 summers earlier. Someone had written a single line and never followed up on it anywhere else in the book. Heard it again last night. Didn't open the door. Nothing else. No explanation. No follow-up entry the next day. Nothing. I never met whoever wrote that. I don't know if they finished the season or left early, but I read that line probably 100 times before summer ended, and I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. Whatever's out there, I wasn't the first person it knocked for. I doubt I'll be the last. The rest of that season, nothing came close to matching that one night, though I'd be lying if I said the cabin ever fully went back to feeling like the peaceful retreat it had been those first few weeks. There was one more evening, maybe 6 weeks after the knocking, where I was climbing down from the tower, a little later than usual, dusk already settling in, and I could have sworn I saw something standing at the tree line, just at the edge of where the cleared area around my station gave way to forest. It didn't move the whole time I looked at it, and by the time I got my binoculars up to actually confirm anything, it was gone, if it had ever really been there at all. I finished out my contract, went home in September, and haven't taken a job that isolated since, even though a small part of me sometimes misses the quiet. By sunrise, the knocking had long since stopped. I opened the door to find nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt around the cabin. No sign anyone or anything had stood there at all. Not even a disturbance in the pine needles that covered most of the ground within a few feet of the door, which should have shown something if a person of any size had genuinely been standing there knocking for the better part of an hour. I radioed the other lookout again, and he simply said, "Yeah, that's about how it goes," and told me to keep the door locked from then on, which I did for the rest of that season, every single night, no exceptions, even on the calmest, most ordinary evenings when nothing at all was wrong, when the only sound outside was wind moving gently through the trees, and nothing about the night felt threatening in any way. That's the first story. This next one is a little different, comes from someone who wasn't stationed anywhere remote for work, just found themselves isolated by accident in a place they never expected to feel unsafe. Story 2. The broken down road. My car broke down on a rural highway during a road trip, late at night, in a stretch with no cell service, and no other cars for what felt like an unreasonable amount of time. I'd been driving for hours, tired, trying to make it to a motel a friend had recommended, one of those long solo drives you take specifically because you want the time alone with your own thoughts, when the engine just gave out. No warning lights beforehand, just a sudden loss of power that coasted me onto the shoulder. the kind of silence that follows an engine dying, that feels much louder than it should. Somehow, in contrast to the road noise you'd gotten used to for hours. I should say this was a trip I'd planned pretty carelessly. Honestly, the kind of thing you do in your 20s, when you've got more free time than sense. I hadn't really looked closely at the route beyond checking that it was the fastest way. Hadn't thought about how much of it would run through stretches, without towns, without gas stations, without anything really except trees, and the occasional turnoff to somewhere I couldn't have named. My car was older too, not in terrible shape, but not exactly reliable either. The kind of car you keep driving, because getting a new one feels like a problem for future you to deal with. I sat there for a while trying my phone, watching the signal bars flicker between nothing and a single, useless bar that never held long enough to send a text. Refreshing the screen every so often like that might somehow change the outcome. The road was completely dark in both directions. No streetlights, just my hazards blinking against the black, casting brief orange light on the guardrail, and the tree line just beyond it before fading again into darkness. I want to be honest that my first instinct wasn't fear, just frustration, the ordinary annoyance of bad luck on a long trip, the kind of mental math you do about how much this was going to cost and how much later it was going to make everything. After maybe 40 minutes of sitting there, I saw headlights approaching from behind and felt a wave of relief that quickly complicated itself the closer the vehicle got. It was a large, older pickup truck, moving slower than normal traffic speed, and instead of passing me, it pulled onto the shoulder behind my car and stopped, engine still running, headlights on high beam, making it impossible for me to see anything beyond the glare in my mirrors. Nobody got out for almost a full minute. I sat there gripping my steering wheel, watching that truck sit motionless behind me, trying to decide whether this was someone stopping to help or something I should be genuinely afraid of. I locked my doors as quietly as I could manage. Eventually, the driver's door of the truck opened, and a figure got out, silhouetted against his own headlights, so I couldn't make out any features at all. Just a shape, tall, unhurried, walking toward my car at a pace that felt deliberately slow. He stopped a few feet from my window and just stood there, not knocking, not speaking, seemingly looking in at me, without making any move to communicate. I remember focusing on small details in those seconds, the way your mind does when it's trying to process something it doesn't have a category for yet. The way his shadow stretched long across the pavement toward my door. The fact that his truck's engine was still running behind him, headlights still on high beam, like he hadn't actually committed to staying, like part of him was still ready to just get back in and leave at any moment. I found myself doing the math on how fast I could possibly get my own dead car moving if I needed to, and coming up with an answer that wasn't reassuring at all. I didn't roll down my window. I sat frozen, trying to decide what to do, very aware of how completely alone I was on that stretch of road. No houses, no other cars, nothing but this silhouette standing beside my broken-down car in the dark, close enough now that I could see he wasn't moving at all, just standing there with his hands at his side, head tilted very slightly like he was studying me through the glass, without any hurry to actually say whatever it was he'd come over to say. After what felt like an unreasonably long time, but was probably less than a minute, he finally spoke, his voice muffled through the glass, asking if I needed help. Something about the delay before he'd said anything, the way he just stood there watching first, kept me from feeling reassured by the offer, and I noticed my hand had moved, without me really deciding to move it, to hover over the door lock, checking it again, even though I already knew it was engaged. I told him, loudly enough to be heard through the window, that I'd already called for a tow truck and help was on the way, which was a complete lie, since I hadn't been able to get a call through at all. He stood there a moment longer, and then, without responding to what I'd said, walked back to his truck, got in, and sat there with the engine running for several more minutes, before finally pulling away, driving off in the same direction he'd been heading originally, his headlights shrinking slowly into the distance until the road was fully dark again, and I was alone with just my own hazards blinking against the night. I sat in that car for almost 2 more hours before another vehicle finally came by. This time someone who actually did stop to help. A middle-aged woman who let me sit in her car while she called a tow service on her phone, which had a stronger signal than mine ever managed. One of those small mercies that felt disproportionately significant after the hours I just spent alone on that shoulder. She mentioned she didn't usually stop for strangers on the stretch either, late as it was, but something about seeing me sitting there alone with my hazards on had made her feel like she couldn't just keep driving. When the tow truck eventually arrived, the driver mentioned, almost in passing, while hooking up my car, that this particular stretch of highway had a reputation locally, that it wasn't the first time someone had reported a truck stopping behind broken-down cars out there, never causing any confirmed harm as far as he knew, but never quite explained either, a detail he delivered so casually that it took me a second to register just how unsettling it actually was. I never found out who that man was, or what he actually wanted, standing silently beside my window in the dark before finally speaking, or why he'd waited so long, both before getting out of his truck and before saying anything at all. If his intention really had just been to offer help like any decent person passing a broken-down car late at night. I've thought about what would have happened if I'd rolled the window down, or worse, if that second car hadn't come along when it did, whether he would have just repeated the offer and left, or whether the whole encounter would have gone somewhere I still don't want to imagine. Here's the part I haven't told many people. About 8 months after all this, I was driving home from a friend's place. Different car, different road entirely, nowhere near that original stretch of highway. It was late, not quite as late as that first night, but late enough. I stopped at a gas station to fill up, one of those mostly empty ones off the interstate, with just a couple pumps lit under fluorescent lights. While I was standing there, I noticed a truck pull in on the far side of the lot. Same make, same color, same slightly raised look to it that I remember. I told myself trucks like that aren't rare. Plenty of people drive them. I finished pumping my gas faster than I needed to and got back on the road without looking over again. And I never actually saw the driver, never got close enough to know if it was even the same person. But something about the shape of it sitting there under those lights made my hands go cold on the wheel the entire drive home. I brought it up to my friend a few weeks later, the one whose place I'd been driving home from that night, mostly just to see if saying it out loud would make it sound as unreasonable as I suspected it might. She didn't laugh it off the way I half expected. She just asked if I'd gotten the plate number, and when I said no, not that night on the highway, and not at the gas station either, she got quiet for a second and said maybe I should start writing things like that down when they happen, just in case, which wasn't exactly comforting advice, but felt true enough that I actually started doing it, a habit that's stuck with me since, a running note on my phone of anything that's ever made me feel that same specific kind of wrong. I don't drive that original stretch of highway anymore if I can help it, and if I ever have to, I make sure my tank is full well before I get anywhere close. And I've started keeping a portable charger and an actual paper map in the car. Small precautions that probably wouldn't have changed much that night, but make me feel slightly less powerless thinking about it now. I know it was probably nothing. That gas station. I know trucks like that are common enough, but I haven't been able to convince the part of my brain that flinched to actually believe that yet. And I don't know that I ever fully will, no matter how many years pass between now and that night on the shoulder. And that's it for today. If either of these hit a little too close to home, especially if you've ever found yourself genuinely alone somewhere with no one nearby to help, you're not alone in that feeling, trust me. The comment section usually agrees, and it's always a little strange and a little comforting seeing how many people have their own version of this same story. If you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And if something like this has ever happened to you, somewhere remote or isolated, out on a lonely road, deep in the woods, anywhere far enough from other people that help wouldn't have arrived in time, send it my way. You might hear your own story on here next. Stay safe out there. I'll see you in the next one.